So welcome and thank you everybody for joining us today for our C2 Smart webinar. I am Lizzie, a research project manager at C2 Smart, which is a US DOT Tier 1 University Transportation Research Center. And C2 Smart leverages recent advances in big data and technology to solve today's urban mobility challenges. Today, we are joined by NYU's Professor Sarah M. Kaufman, who will present on the Autonomous Vehicle Good Citizenry Standard. Professor Kaufman is the Interim Executive Director of the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation, as well as an Adjunct Associate Professor of Planning at NYU. And then we're also joined by Professor Joseph Chow, Associate Professor in the Department of Civil and Engineering at NYU, and the Deputy Director of C2 Smart. Some quick notes before we get going. We will be recording this session and then uploading it to C2 Smart's YouTube channel. And we encourage everybody to ask questions today by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and then we will read out your questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will hand things over to Professor Kaufman to get us started.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share a bit about this project. Okay, so the autonomous vehicle standard has turned into, was kind of rebranded as autonomous vehicles in New York City. What would the policy look like for bringing autonomous vehicles to New York City? So I'm very grateful for the support of C2 Smart in developing this project, and to my colleague Chow, who did a lot of really interesting work related to the equity portion of this project. I am with the NYU Rudin Center, as Lizzie mentioned. And I'll introduce the project a bit. The idea was to address three primary concerns. The first is the consumer interest in autonomous vehicles. Even though we know autonomous vehicles are not city ready yet, there is a kind of consumer demand. And you can see in this image the dashboard of a Tesla, which, as we know, users are tapping into the somewhat autonomous functionalities without actually the technology being fully ready. So there is consumer demand, which is a concern. Secondly, there is profound congestion in New York City, as we all know. And so even if we introduce cars with new technologies, there's still cars causing congestion on our streets. And that's a New York City specific problem, but of course, congestion exists in most places. And then finally, there are a lot of equity questions brought into play here. Who has access to new technologies? Who has access to new modes? And what does that mean? And what you see on this image is a snapshot from a previous Rudin Center project on mobility equity in New York City neighborhoods, and what access to transportation means in terms of people having steady income, having access to jobs, and being able to move upward in their career trajectories. And so simply automating vehicles would not on its own augment the opportunities of these populations. The guiding question for this project is, what are the policy goals for permitting AVs in New York City? And while we're still a ways away, we do tend to look at these vehicles from a safety-only perspective, which is fantastic, but we need to not look at them in a vacuum. So what are we looking at from a citywide perspective when we think about AVs in New York City? And so the purpose of this project is to look at New York City's kind of three primary goals of safety, equity, and sustainability when we think about transportation here. And of course, efficiency, which is a fourth pillar of this discussion. For this project, we focused on three policy areas, and they were divided up into stakeholder workshops, which I'll get into in a moment. The first looked at community outreach, what that might look like, integration with public transit, which again is a New York City specific focus, and New York City governance, which is what are the local governmental allowances and needs for introducing AVs here. Obviously, vehicles are usually regulated at the state level and with safety regulated at the federal level. So it's essential to incorporate to consider what the local allowances are. Secondly, we looked at safety, data, and privacy. So safety being a standalone topic, obviously something that is being considered far and wide. Data and privacy are key aspects when you consider how much data is being collected by vehicles, and it's unclear what might be done on the back end of that data collection. And then finally, equity in terms of race, gender, income, and accessibility, which is of course essential in terms of users' abilities, physical and cognitive abilities, and disabilities, and what that might mean and what the requirements might be. So these are the key policy focus areas. And so our approach to this project was first to review and evaluate previous research on this topic, and then we convened a series of virtual workshops. We did 3 workshops to look at the larger policy issues around autonomous vehicles. And then we developed this policy framework focusing on incentivizing a few different areas, especially equity, sustainability, and responsible use of data. I do want to say that when we talk about AVs, there's a pretty broad swath of discussion. So we had some assumptions going in. So the discussion covered AVs at a level 4 and up, where basically a driver is not necessary. Using the SAE levels, the consideration for this discussion is that these are vehicles operating without a driver. Secondly, that this discussion operates on an assumption that AVs will be safe enough to operate in New York City. And we can have a conversation about what safe enough is, but the assumption is that AVs are deemed safe, they will be coming to New York City, what policies need to be in place. Thirdly, we're assuming that many of these vehicles will be shared rides, and that's a way to incentivize sustainability and efficiency of our streets. If we introduce a large number of private vehicles, we will counteract any congestion mitigation efforts here in New York City. And furthermore, the vehicles should all be electric. Any introduction of new vehicles cannot assume that they will be gas powered, which counteracts sustainability goals in a profound way. There are some areas of opportunities in integrating autonomous vehicles. In general, it's a generational transformation. So as many of you probably know already, it could optimize people and the transportation of people and goods throughout the city, reduce congestion by having cars operate more efficiently, more directly, reducing conflicts on streets, and of course, reducing emissions by using electric power. It could improve street safety by, because AVs are known to follow the rules a lot better than human drivers tend to, and AVs don't drive drunk. And it could also, this is in an ideal world, it could increase equity through increased transportation access, providing access to populations that wouldn't already have access to these new modes of transportation and get people around more efficiently than traditional transit allows. Of course, that was the optimistic view, but we also need to consider what's at stake. So there are some challenges. The first is increased congestion, which has to do with a lot of people starting to purchase these vehicles, and then non-tailpipe pollution, which is pollution generated from other factors like tires and noise pollution as well. Of course, it could erode transit ridership, taking choice riders away from public transit and into these vehicles. More vehicle miles traveled because people might be incentivized to take this interesting new mode that would be potentially door to door. And it could exacerbate inequities in access and accessibility because these vehicles, especially those from private providers, may not reach all neighborhoods and may not be required to have accessible vehicles. So taking all of that into account, we hosted 3 stakeholder working groups on Zoom in December of 2022. Actually, it's December of 2021, sorry about that. We had a diversity of backgrounds, people who were in academia, practitioners, advocates, and more. For each session, we had 1 or 2 expert presentations followed by facilitated discussions in breakout rooms. And then we had a report back, and that led to a further discussion about points where the group agreed and disagreed about the kind of policy outcomes that should emerge from these conversations. I'll get into the specific workshops now. The first workshop was on community outreach, integration with transit, and New York City governance. So those are 3 kind of large topics, but we asked specific guiding questions for these facilitated discussions. So community outreach was focused on hearing community goals in opposition to the introduction of autonomous vehicles, but also fostering innovation and equity. So how can we introduce this new mode, remove kind of the fear that people have, and also use AVs to propel these goals forward, to propel their community goals forward. What does the community need? And also, what can we provide in an innovative way that would help these communities achieve their goals? Integrating with transit, of course, is a New York City specific question, but obviously transit is the lifeblood of New York City. So the question is, how might AVs and transit coexist in an efficient and sustainable mobility menu for New Yorkers? So it's really about how do we ensure that AVs are a complement and not a competition for public transit. And then finally, we asked how local government might address data stewardship to ensure that AV companies or AV developers are protecting data, not releasing it or sharing it, and how are they keeping it secure, as well as what power does the government have to set equitable deployments, and what partnership can be used through experiential learning. So what kind of learnings can we have with places like government offices and schools and workforce development? The second workshop was around equity and accessibility. So for the equity discussion, we asked, how can we promote the engagement and voices of diverse populations in developing, testing, and using AVs? This discussion really centered around including these diverse voices from the outset, from the point when these vehicles are being developed. And accessibility, of course, how can we develop these vehicles as well as deploy these vehicles, especially in their interaction with the curb? And especially when we think about accessibility, we often think about wheelchairs, but there are so many other forms of disabilities that we need to be considering. So sensory disabilities, cognitive disabilities. So how can you have a rider match up with a vehicle if they are vision impaired? How can they find their ride? How can they hear how can they be alerted to their upcoming stop on when they're on the vehicle? How can they be informed about it if they are hearing impaired? These are all considerations that have to be brought into the conversation when we consider accessibility. And then the final workshop was on safety and data and privacy. So in the question of safety, what are the challenges specific to New York City's density, built environment, and personality? That is, that New York is obviously an incredibly dense city and has a specific built environment, a unique environment, which factors into the street safety challenges. And personality is maybe a shorthand way of saying we need to look at personal safety on board the vehicle. What can we do to ensure that these shared rides are safe? As we know, there are incidents of sexual harassment and crime on public transit. So how do we keep people safe when they are on these shared rides, and what can be put into place, especially if we're integrating with private providers? And then in the area of data and privacy, how can data be collected and kept private and also shared with the city government to be used for the city's purposes, with information like potholes and construction sites and other pieces of information that would be beneficial to New York City's operations? And can there be a requirement built in for these factors? So out of these 3 workshops, we developed 7 policy principles for AVs in New York City. And I'll run through them at a high level, but I will link to the report at the end if you want to dive in a bit more. The first principle is that safety is paramount to the introduction of autonomous vehicles on city streets. And this is kind of a no-brainer. Specifically, it needs to fit into the Vision Zero goals of New York City, which is that we will not have any pedestrian or cyclist or passenger fatalities on city streets. And, how can we ensure that AVs are safe enough to operate on city streets? And of course, we need to consider how they interact with other modes. Are they designed to interact with human-driven vehicles, with traffic lights and lane lines, and restaurant sheds, other factors, and of course, bikes and mopeds and other modes? Are they, because on a highway or in a less dense city, this might not be as essential of a factor, but here in New York City, it's likely that these vehicles will have about 50 of these interactions on every block. And then, of course, onboard safety, which I mentioned earlier, is how can we ensure that people are safe on board the vehicles, and what pieces are in place where they can call emergency services if necessary. If they need to leave the vehicle early, what is in place for them to be able to do that? So these are some of the safety factors we considered. Oh, and first responders, of course. How might a vehicle need to get pulled over? How can a vehicle know if a fire truck or an ambulance needs to get past, what the vehicle should do? We've seen some issues with this in San Francisco, and hopefully we won't replicate those here in New York City. Secondly, we need to serve all New Yorkers equitably, raising the voices of our diverse populations and developing, testing, and using AVs to make them accessible to all. This is kind of a catch-all for a big topic, but basically it boils down to a few top-line areas. The first being neighborhood equity. How do we ensure that neighborhoods of all demographics have access to this new technology and that their concerns are being heard? Secondly, vehicle accessibility. As I mentioned, they need to be boardable from using mobility devices and from the curb, which is kind of the bare minimum of accessibility. And how might people without cell phones, without credit cards, be able to access these vehicles, be able to summon them, and interact with them? And then, of course, New York City, as um, as the largest city in the country, has about 180,000 professional drivers. These are people driving taxis, Ubers, Lyfts, all sorts of vehicles. So assuming these vehicles, the AVs come in at level 4 or 5, what happens to people who drive as a profession? That's a large number of people. The vast majority of them are foreign born and don't have access to a different career path immediately. So, what can be done ensure to ensure a next step in careers for these professional drivers? Almost 200,000 professional drivers that who need to be accounted for. Next, engage New York's diverse communities, hearing out community goals and concerns while also promoting innovation and equity. So in the first step, there was some concern in the workshop, in the working groups, that public officials don't completely understand how AVs work. And so a first step would be helping public officials understand what they're looking at. Secondly, public engagement should inform the standards for meaningful AV testing. That means that by reaching out to communities and explaining how AVs work and allowing communities to see how AVs might operate within their neighborhoods would be more meaningful than using, say, a closed course and not getting the input of people's lived experiences. And then furthermore, employing from within the city, within the neighborhoods where they're operating, AV companies can make a big difference, especially in workforce development. And that can be anything from mechanics to coders to vehicle operators. And it's essential that any company coming in should hire from within the city. And we see this in other areas. New York City requires other industries to hire a fixed percentage of employees from within New York City. And so using this precedent, it is sensible to require the same. Fourth, the shared ride autonomous vehicles must coexist with public transportation. As I said before, there should be an expectation that AVs will complement rather than compete with public services. The last thing we want is an erosion of public transit, which would lead to congestion and many challenges on New York City streets, as well as the degradation of the public transit system. We should also explore first and last mile microtransit opportunities. So getting people home or to transit stations, it could actually help a lot with public safety concerns. And it could incentivize people to take the train when they have an easier way to get to it. In addition, there could potentially be an opportunity to share technologies. So AV technologies could potentially be applied to buses, even just driver assistance systems that would be assistive in helping transit move more efficiently. The fifth principle covers new technologies introduced by AVs should foster increasingly intelligent interactions between vehicles and the city. This addresses the smart cities aspect of cities. So looking at trip data, not only should trip data flow from providers to the city to help the city understand the transit needs throughout the city, but also the city should be able to provide data to AV companies for things like road construction that may impinge on how the vehicles are operating in the city. As we discussed, data privacy and data protection should have standards in place. And one major area that is happening here in New York City is improving the curb. And so how do we optimize curb usage for things like pickup and drop off for these vehicles, but also sidewalk restaurants, containerized trash, any other use of the curb. That is something that is being researched and analyzed right now. And how might AVs contribute to the discussion there? Next, augment New York City's ongoing sustainability efforts. Of course, these vehicles need to be sustainable and not add to the challenges that we face with pollution, congestion, and asthma rates. So obviously they should be required to be zero emissions, which would be a state requirement rather than a city. They should not increase vehicles' miles traveled. We'll need to minimize cruising for passengers where these vehicles are traveling with zero passengers on board. And of course, we need to enable sustainable street infrastructure uses. So offering off-street parking and it should help enable things like rain gardens that would help capture flooding and other such uses that the AVs should not get in the way of and could potentially help to promote if they are making a more efficient use of curb space. And then the seventh and final principle is that public-private partnerships are key. So none of these policies are possible without, and none of these improvements are possible without public-private partnerships. So not only do we need to partner between government and the private sector, as well as, of course, advocacy groups, we do need to prepare for future developments. It's clear that AVs, while they're transformational, we also need to think about what else is coming down the pike. So, of course, there are AVs for passenger transport, goods transport, but what else is coming and how can we set the stage and how can we use this opportunity to set the stage for future developments? Things like sidewalk robots, things that we just haven't even seen yet. What can we do to establish a precedent here? It's also an opportunity to think seriously about microtransit, public-private partnership that allows for microtransit, especially for groups like shift workers or people who are at anchor workplaces but have off-hours commutes. They're often depending on a slow and unreliable transit system at, say, 3 in the morning when they're traveling to their 5 a.m. shift at the package sorting center, for example. What can we put in place in the form of microtransit to get people from one neighborhood to one job center, for example? And of course, we need to leverage existing workforce development programs. New York City has a large number of workforce development programs, and there's a great opportunity to leverage these programs for actually implementing AVs and the people who will work on them to advance their capabilities and job opportunities. So I know I threw a lot at you, and I'm happy to take questions. There's a link here to the actual project, and also my email address if you want to send me a note. And I do want to point out Chow, who is also here, did a lot of work on the equity, and he can answer more questions about his data analysis pertaining to neighborhood equity. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And as a reminder, like Professor Kaufman said, we invite all questions. So if you have one, please enter yours by pressing the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the Zoom window. Oh, we got one. What are some specific challenges you see freight facing?
So that's a great question. I think that this project specifically does not address highways, which I think the majority of freight transport occurs on, and more locally, there are challenges of theft, for example, but actually we're working on a project with Neuro, and actually we've just released it about 30 minutes ago for the next iteration of this project. And Neuro, if you're not familiar with them, is a goods delivery autonomous vehicle service. And so they've done a lot of, it's not freight necessarily, but it's goods delivery. And they've done a great job of ensuring that the goods are secured and go directly to the recipient. But I do think that there is a challenge specifically in moving freight from, say, highways into cities and how that transfer point.
Great. We have another one. How can we look toward the future to share data from various entities?
How can we look towards the future to share data from various entities? I'm sorry, can you clarify that?
Charles, if you want to add some information to your question, maybe that'd be helpful.
Yeah, New York City has data. Yes. New York City has data and tolling data, of course, and obviously there will be more tolling data once congestion pricing is in place. And one great unique thing about New York City is that city government is actually pretty adept at sharing data, and so I think that we here in academia, as well as AV developers, will make great use of that tolling data. And in terms of AV developers, it can be used for tracking where their vehicles are going. It can enhance the trip data and share traffic congestion information, as well as other factors like special events and road conditions. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities to share data, and tolling data will only enhance that opportunity.
Yeah, let me add to that too. I think there's definitely a lot of uses of the data that's already out there for New York City, like the taxi data, which really helps people, researchers understand the different travel patterns that New Yorkers have. And like Sarah said, with these new data sources coming in, with congestion pricing, for example, or even as like the Omni system from MTA matures and makes the data more available, I think there'll be a lot more that we can do with that. So yeah, a lot of opportunities there, and I think there's also a lot of discussions about guidelines for how these data can be shared, and in what formats, and ways to maintain privacy. So it's a very active area that's being studied.
We have another one. What is the potential impact on people with disabilities? This community varies in terms of their daily challenges in traveling. In travel.
I believe that's navigating and traveling.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Roger. That's a good and important question. So the impact, if these vehicles are introduced without standards for accessibility, there's a real challenge for people with disabilities, obviously. That's why one of the goals of this project is to encourage requirements that set standards for accessibility for physical needs, things like mobility devices, regulations requiring the allowance of service animals on board, usage like text when there are verbal announcements, as well as verbal announcements when there are only written ones, so that people with hearing impairments, vision impairments can interact with the vehicle. So, and from the city side, I think that we need to clearly establish curb space for pickup and drop off so that people, especially in using mobility devices, don't have to navigate their way through parked cars to try and access their pickup vehicle, which presents a huge challenge. We'll need the vehicles to be able to line up right into the curb, right up to the curb.
Great. All right, those are all the questions we have. We can wait for maybe another minute if anybody has any others. And if not, I want to thank everybody for joining, and to Professor Kaufman for presenting, and Professor Chow. Again, a recording of this webinar will be available on the C2 Smart Center's YouTube channel and website. And this webinar was brought to you today by C2 Smart and the US DOT's University Transportation Center program. And we don't have any more questions, so I think we can call it a day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.